What's going on, guys? It's Nick here, back with another video. Today we'll be going over 5 running backs to trade for or away this week, although as per usual, we'll focus more on players to trade for since trading away deals much more with the needs of the other team. But every week we will go over one player I do have some level of concern with. And guess what? We finally don't have to talk about Mixon as a buy low anymore. He decided to pack just his entire first month of production into 1 week. And crazily enough, because of week 4, because of how many points he scored, he is now the running back 8 in half PPR scoring. That is just nuts that he just decided to do all of it in 1 week. We also can't really go over Gibson anymore. He has been our top target, and I think you can still target him because I think he's going to be the feature back, but scoring in 3 consecutive weeks, just not the time you usually want to target running backs in trades. So hopefully, maybe, well, I guess not hopefully because I have him everywhere, but hopefully if you don't have him, he has some bad weeks, and then you can go out and get him, but not really trading for him at the moment because, again, 3 touchdowns, 3 weeks. But we do have 5 names to go over today, and we will get to that right after we do the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat was in week 4, which wide receiver with at least 5 targets had the best catch rate? And the answer is DJ Chark, catching 8 of 9 targets. Griffin Ross was the first to get that one right. Today's stat, through the first 4 weeks, which quarterback has thrown the most end zone targets? Now, I'll give you a hint. This player does not rank inside the top 5 in touchdown passes, indicating some potential positive touchdown regression. So let's start this video off with Jonathan Taylor. Taylor's coming off back-to-back fairly mediocre weeks, but it's worth noting that in week 3, it was part of just a massive blowout. He had 14 touches on 24 total snaps, at least snaps that he played. And as a team, they didn't really have the ball that much. They were scoring defensive touchdowns. They had really long drives, so just the total play volume was way down. So you kind of need to throw that game out a little bit. Not surprising that he didn't have a fantastic week. Then this past week, he did have 18 touches, 79 total yards. He just didn't score a touchdown. Now, the snaps were a bit low again. The percent of snap split was 46% for Taylor, 35% for Hines, and then 17% for Wilkins. And the touches were split 18 for Taylor, 12 for Hines, 10 for Wilkins. I think it's important not to overreact to the Hines and Wilkins touches. Taylor isn't going to dominate the backfield touches because they don't want to give him 30 touches every single week, right? They don't want him to just break down halfway through the year and then they have to only use Wilkins and Hines. That's not part of what they want to do. This offense is going to feature the running back, and so if they're going to give their running backs 40 touches, well, then they have to mix in some of these backups. They're not giving Taylor all of that work. He has averaged 18.75 touches per game, and I think that's roughly what we should expect moving forward. Maybe it's a little bit low. Maybe he averages closer to 16 to 18, 19 carries, and then maybe 2 to 3 targets each week. If the 1 target, so in back-to-back weeks, I believe he's had 1 target. If that continues, I'll be a little bit concerned. But right now, I don't think it's a huge issue, especially because this is Phillip Rivers throwing him the ball. A lot of quarterbacks, if you're getting 1 target a week, you're only catching, a pass every other week, and it's for 3 yards, and that's useless. But Rivers is one of, if not the best screen game quarterback in the entire league. And so when he has a target to Taylor, it's usually a scripted target. It's usually going to be caught. I believe he's caught every single target so far this season, and there's a lot of upside in that target. So I think over time, he's going to average closer to 2 or 3, which means he's going to have 2 to 3 receptions a game for 20 to 30 yards. And that's a really nice floor to go along with, like I said, that 16 to 19 carry on average range. And he is also going to be a running back 1 rest of season because of the touchdowns. We know that they are going to feature him in the red zone. They're going to give him a ton of carries when they get in close. And because of that, he could score 15 touchdowns this season. That is not an unrealistic expectation. And given that you just cannot say that about very many running backs, he has to be treated as running back 1. And I think after back-to-back weeks of, I'm not going to say poor production because he scored the touchdown in week 3, but less than we were expecting, I think you might be able to get him for cheaper than that. So I would go after Jonathan Taylor. Next up, we have Miles Sanders. Sanders is averaging 20 touches per game, including 6.3 targets per game, which is crazy high. Yet he only ranks 20th in fantasy points per game. His issue is in a few areas. First is just the 1 touchdown, but that's not really a concern. Boston Scott isn't a threat to that role, so it's going to improve. Touchdowns are a little bit random, and he only has played in 3 games, so scoring in 1 of 3 isn't like horrible or anything. So he's going to score touchdowns this season. I wouldn't be concerned with that. The main problem for me is just Carson Wentz. He has been extremely bad this season, and it's led to Sanders converting his 19 targets into just 9 receptions for 78 scoreless yards. And as of Monday, he ranks 6th in targets, but 25th in receptions and 24th in yardage. Wentz has just not looked good, and there's really not that much Sanders can do at times. Ultimately, I do think a lot of it has to do with the injuries. When you lose Goddard, Alshon, Deshaun Jackson, Rager, J-Jaws, I guess, but just all of the players that you thought were going to be the starters this season are just out. It doesn't leave you with a whole lot of talent to throw to, especially when Ertz looks just as washed as he does. So I do expect the offense to improve a good amount once they get these guys back and healthy, and that'll directly impact Miles Sanders. He's still playing over 75% of the snaps. He's still going to be very involved in the receiving game every single week. He's going to be featured in the red zone, and that does make him a low-end running back 1, and you might be able to get him a little bit cheaper than that, so I would target him in trades as well. Next up is a sell high where we have Melvin Gordon. Gordon currently ranks as a running back 10 overall thanks to 4 touchdowns, and is coming off 23 carries for 107 yards and 2 touchdowns on 80% of the snaps as basically the featured back. If you watch the game though, then you'll remember that he had 22 carries for 64 yards and a touchdown before that late 4th quarter touchdown on the busted play. You know, it was a play that he probably should have been tackled for like a 3 or 4 yard loss, but it turns into a 49-yard touchdown. But if he had averaged 53 yards on 16 carries per game without Lindsey, then people would be much more concerned than they are right now. But that is what he's averaged outside of that 1 busted play, and we know for a fact that Lindsey is going to take more work once he returns than Royce Freeman has. They were splitting the workload right down the middle when Lindsey went down, and that's what we should expect to happen again once he returns. So given that Lindsey is likely going to return this week, it would be smart to capitalize on Melvin Gordon's big week and try and get running back 1 value for him in return. That might seem bold, but with all the injuries this season, there are absolutely teams in your league that are just desperate. And so take advantage of that. There are teams in your league who are starting backup running backs or starting running backs that are only going to get 7, 8, 9 touches every week. And so if you offer them Melvin Gordon, they're going to place a much higher value on that, even though maybe they shouldn't. Because again, if you're splitting volume on an offense like Denver that is fine, but at least until Drew Lock returns, isn't going to be that great. And even when he does, they have injuries as well on the offensive side that they're just fine. I don't think anyone's going to argue with you that Denver is not an elite offense. And so when you have running backs splitting the workload on a fairly mediocre offense, that's not great. And it's definitely not running back 1. So if you can get running back 1 value, I would. This week we have 2 players that I want to discuss a little bit more in depth because I don't think their value is cut and dry. So first up, we've got Josh Jacobs. I included him in last week's video as a buy low, and my main reasonings were the touches. He was averaging 26 touches per game, which is insane. And then also the targets. You know, he averaged 2 targets per game last year, but was up to 4.3 per game this year. And then the role. Last season he was being phased out in losses, but it was encouraging to see that he had 19 touches in a blowout loss to New England in week 3. After week 4, I think all of that remains true. They lost again, and while he didn't have 19 touches, he had 18, and he maintained his receiving role, getting another 4 targets. In fact, there was actually a little bit more to be encouraged about this week. He only played 59% of the snaps in their week 3 loss, but he was up to 68% in week 4, likely because the game was closer for longer. His issue right now is the touchdowns. He had 3 in that week 1 matchup with Carolina, but since then, he hasn't scored. And just like we saw with Joe Mixon, if you aren't scoring, it really hurts your fantasy value, especially when you're only averaging 3.6 yards per carry like Jacobs is right now. I view Jacobs very similarly to Mixon last week. He's getting the touches. In fact, he's actually leading the league in carries, and he's amongst the top 15 in targets, at least among running backs, of course. And I'm not concerned about the role at all. The Raiders have no competent backup. So as long as their games are relatively close, he's going to get like 17 to 25 carries. That's the thing with Jacobs. It's like Jacobs and Henry are 2 running backs that most running backs, when their games are close, they're getting like 17 to 20 carries. They're not typically getting too many more than that. But you look at Derrick Henry, he could get 32 carries in a week. And there's very few running backs that are on pace with that. But Jacobs is. In games where the Raiders are leading and they're going up against just not an elite run defense, just average to below average run defense, we can see Jacobs approach 30 and maybe even go over 30 carries. So even in games that they aren't dominating, if he's getting the 16, 18, 19 carries, but he also has the upside to go for 30 carries, that's very important. That really helps his weekly upside, and we want players who have weekly upside. And so when you factor that in, and you also say he's going to get 3 to 5 targets each week, could see spikes from there. I don't think he's a player who's going to see that many spiked weeks in the targets, but the spiked weeks will come on the carries. And so if he's getting, 28 carries and 4 targets in a week, he doesn't have to do a whole lot to finish as a running back 1, to go along with virtually all of the goal line work. The Raiders will never be amongst the league leaders in points. So one thing is that he does have less touchdown upside than a guy like Jonathan Taylor that we talked about before. The Raiders are just not going to score 30 points every week. I don't think the Colts are going to do that as much, but I do not believe the Raiders in their range of outcomes have just a monster touchdown ceiling for Jacobs. He would have to get pretty lucky, but we've kind of been seeing that if he's going to finish, at 12 to 15 touchdowns, it's going to come in spiked weeks. It's going to come when 3 in week 1, and then maybe 2 in week 5, and another 2 in week 10. It's not going to come 1 touchdown every week, which does hurt a little bit, but you know what? It's like we talked about. We like those spiked weeks because they do help us win matchups, and he has enough volume. This is, I guess, the most important point. Jacobs has enough volume each week to where he's not a complete dud. Because he's getting these 4 targets every single week, he's catching a few of them. He's at least getting, you're 2 for 15 in the receiving game, which sounds like nothing, but it does help his floor. When he's getting, 16, 17, 18 carries, even in those weeks where he duds, it's not a complete crater to your roster. You can still be fine. And because of that, I do view him as a running back 1. And it is possible, like I've said with some of these other running backs, that he's cheaper than that, thanks to 12, 9.8, and 8.8 fantasy points over his last 3. But these kind of seem like his floor while he's not scoring. And once he does score, that's going to go way up. So I would trade for him now before that happens. Someone that I don't have that same outlook towards is Kenyan Drake. Drake gained 35 yards on 13 carries in week 4 and is now the running back 33 overall, thanks to just 5 total targets on the season. After joining the Cardinals last season, Drake had at least 4 targets in 6 out of 8 games, but this season he has target counts of 2, 2, 1, and 0. His snap share has stayed pretty constant at between 65 and 71%, and he's averaged 18 touches per week. Unfortunately, like I said, the receiving volume has just dried up. 18 touches is great, but if it's all carries, then, that's not great, right? Receptions are worth significantly more than carries are, which is why players like Alvin Kamara can be easy top 3 running backs despite ranking 20th in carries. The bad news here is that this isn't a fluke. Drake is just no longer getting these scheme targets, so any that he gets is really just low upside dump-offs. This is a different situation to what we discussed with Joe Mixon last week. Joe Mixon was getting 20 touches per game, but he was getting some schemed looks in the receiving game, and the most important factor was there was no one behind him. Bernard is a fine backup and unfortunately does take some receiving snaps, but he's no real threat to Mixon's role. Chase Edmonds is a legitimate threat to Drake. He plays between 32 and 37% of the snaps each week while seeing 7.25 touches per game. And the problem is those touches that Edmonds are getting carry a lot of the high value touches amongst the running backs in Arizona. He's seeing 4.5 targets per game, including 5 red zone targets on the season. Remember, Drake has 5 total targets. So when they get into the red zone, they're taking Drake off the field, they're putting Edmonds in, and they're featuring him. They prefer Chase Edmonds when they get close, and that is not good to the value of Kenyan Drake. Also, Edmonds might only have 19% of the total carries between the two, but he's got 25% of the red zone carries. And that might not seem like a big difference, but when you add in the 4 red zone receptions, it means Edmonds has 40% of the red zone touches. That's a lot. They like Edmonds in the red zone, and his 5 targets makes up 24% of all red zone targets on the team. So looking at all of this, I can't sign off on Drake as a target anymore. There was a chance, in week 1, week 2, week 3, after those weeks that maybe he was going to go back to what his role was last season. But at this point, unless Edmonds were to get hurt, that seems very unlikely. And because of that, this is much closer to what we talked about with AJ Green, not with Joe Mixon. With Mixon, we decided that you basically had to send a trade offer because he was free and we knew at some point he was going to do better. With AJ Green, though, we said that he might just be cooked and the actual trade target here might be T. Higgins. I think that's the case we have with Kenyan Drake. Drake isn't cooked, but his role is. And the real player we should be trying to get in our rosters, if you don't already have him like you probably should, is Chase Edmonds. He's the one getting a bunch of high value touches. And since they would both need the other to get hurt, why wouldn't you want the one who just needs a little bit more volume to smash? Because Edmonds would be a running back 1 if they gave him the work, and yet he'll cost you significantly less than Kenyan Drake will purely because of the name value. So Edmonds was a target every week leading up to now. I am moving him much higher in the list. I think that's the one we aggressively target in trades, or if for some reason he's on free agency, go get him, because I just love the upside that he brings to the team, and he's not going to cost you anything. Whereas with Kenyan Drake, people still remember what he did last season. People still see all these touches, and honestly, at this point, I don't see it. Unless Chase Edmonds gets hurt, I do not see Kenyan Drake paying off, and so I'm not targeting him. I'm targeting Edmonds. So those are my thoughts on 5 different running backs this week. I post a much larger list of trade targets on our website, so if you want to see more options to trade for as well as options to trade away, you can check that out at the website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. That's the end of this one. Hope you all did enjoy. If you did, how about hitting that like button? And how about subscribing to the channel if you're new? But thanks for watching.